This talk is called The Hall of Mirrors, and in the 5 hours before I came here, believe it or not, I made 890 changes in the script. I've already told you, I work from a script for your protection. I never get out of here, because I sort of go off on tangents. And I started with a quote from a famous historian of the period of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. His name was Bernard Bailyn, and he was one of those historians who teach other historians how to write history. Bailyn gave a talk before the American Historical Society in Williamsburg, Virginia, in October the 16th, 1959. And he's probably the reason I'm here, because I picked up his little book, couldn't be 100 pages long, and it was teaching historians that no history of American schooling had ever been written or trod, that what existed were house histories that celebrated the official myths. And the Bailyn book is full of questions that need to be addressed before we can say we know why we have a school institution. I just have one sentence from the Bailyn essay. He tells the other historians, public education, as it was in the late 19th century and is now, was a new and unexpected genus whose ultimate character could not have been predicted and whose emergence troubled well-disposed, high-minded people. I read that when I guess I was about 42 years old. I'm 72 now, and it started me on a quest which continues to answer all of Bailyn's hundreds of questions that the existing literature doesn't answer. And that probably gives rise to the working title of this talk, The Hall of Mirrors, and the subtitle, Everything You Know About School is Wrong. Part 1, Melting Toothbrush Handles. Now I know that you've all heard that schooling used to be much more substantial than it is today. But there are a certain number of, well-disposed skeptics who say, really, the past always looks to be, in retrospect, better than the present. And that's a phenomenon that's universal psychologically. So I happen to have a piece of evidence of how different the past really was, and it's a piece of evidence that comes out of my own boyhood in a coal mining town in western Pennsylvania called Monongahela. My mother purchased for me from the newsstands in Monongahela a book called The Amateur Craftsman's Book of Things to Make. Copyright date was 1937, and I probably began to look at the book in 1942. So I was 7 years old, and I naturally turned to the section that said projects for 10-year-olds. Because I was moving up on 10, I wanted to see what I would be expected to build at 10. Very popular pulp magazine. So I'm going to start with an excerpt from this manual. And I've deliberately skipped the project for 10-year-olds called How to Cut a New Entrance into Your Frame Home, because I thought you wouldn't believe it. So I took a simple project for 10-year-olds. That's 10-year-olds. That's 10-year-old. called Building a Model Racing Schooner. What could be in that might alarm you? Well, maybe the instruction not to waste your money buying glue, since you could take used toothbrush handles, melt them in acetone, and have a very high-grade glue for your 10-year-old project of building a model racing schooner. So we need some glue, but we got that by melting toothbrush handles in acetone. Then after our 10-year-old cuts and planes the hull and the mainmast from blocks of wood and casts the keel in molten lead. Now that may bother the mothers in here. There were millions of copies. This thing was sold all over the country. These were cast the keel in molten lead. Then you mastered diction like jib stay and peak halyard, and you use your 10-year-old sewing skills to sew the foresail. You tackle the main assembly narrative. And I'm only going to trouble you with one paragraph from assembling your model racing schooner. Spring the sides apart and slip the lower ribs in place at their proper stations. Set the ribs in so the bevel begins at the edge of the side, driving a scutcheon pin into each rib from each side. Make the inside keel from a 1/4-inch square wood, fitted inside the inside stem in the notches of the lower ribs, and spring it over to and inside of the stern as shown. Now there's more, but you've heard enough, I think. And remember, I spared you how to cut a new entrance into your frame home to surprise your dad. Don't go in that door, dear. All right, part 2. An efficient market requires stupid customers. So that was 1937, and such instructions for little people were commonplaces from Benjamin Franklin's day until the end of World War I, when a new standard appeared, figuratively almost overnight. The new style, which showed up in big cities first and gradually worked their way through the interior, looked like this. Students were confined to chairs in classrooms. They were publicly ranked against one another for mental quality. They were kept there 6 hours a day, 185 days a year. B, each day students copied notes off blackboards to memorize. They filled in worksheets and they listened to lectures. C, regular pencil paper tests were administered to measure obedience in memorization. Students who fell short were publicly humiliated in a number of officially sanctioned ways. D, all undertakings of the caliber of casting ships' keels in molten lead were forbidden. E, children were sharply enjoined to remain silent. And F, this is a sort of a portmanteau, many other procedures similar in spirit were imposed, which reminded students of their special inferior status. Pedagogy had arrived in America in big-time Prussian fashion. The solution of the mystery why this was done and continues to be done belongs to the realm of philosophy and economics and continues to flow from certain dark corners of human nature. These secrets of human nature were once actively studied in schools in those bygone days before literature and history and economics gave way to language arts, social studies, hygiene, and things like that. Now young people emerge from classrooms into adulthood as innocent of such things as forest savages. They were pushovers for modern marketing. Now kids were taught that they lived to buy stuff and feel good. Now they grew older in school, but they never grew up. Part 3, A New World Order. By 1910, signs were everywhere that a massive project was underway to change the libertarian nature of America from a place of independent livelihoods and self-reliant people into an administrative utopia, one inspired on the surface at least by Edward Bellamy's utopian novel Looking Backwards, by Prussian Germany's victory over France in 1871, and by Frederick W. Taylor, inventor of time and motion studies to control workers' physical movements down to the last scratching of the nostrils. I experienced this firsthand because my first job was in a factory in Bellefontaine, Ohio, near Cincinnati, and I was under the watchful eye of 3 separate time and motion study people. One who told me that when I went to the toilet, the allotted 3 times a day, I took a route that wasted 4 seconds. Times 5 days a week is 20 seconds a week. Times 50 weeks a year, I've already now wasted 4 hours. Every 2 years I would steal a working day from my employer. And if I worked a career of 40 years, you can see I would become a major felon. He showed me how to walk to the toilet and save those 4 seconds. Another person, it was a she this time, instructed me in an incorrect elbow movement I was using because I was a skinny kid. You can't believe that, but very skinny. I had to lift 125-pound pigs of iron and put them into a boxcar. And the only way I could get the thing up, because I don't think I weighed more than 125 pounds, was to make my elbow go this way. But I was instructed that each pig wasted 2 seconds by doing that. Those were the time and motion days. They're still with us, but they're much subtler. Taylor was a rock star in his day. If you've ever played tennis with an aluminum tennis racket, that's Taylor's invention to lighten the strain on the muscles. If you've ever worn a pair of slip-on shoes, that's Taylor's invention. Why would you ever waste time tying it and so on? Philosopher John Dewey wrote that America was being transformed by its most powerful people into a centrally managed village. In this new world order, the public forum would be monopolized by corporations and by large institutions. Individuals and local concerns were now quaint and irrelevant. Dewey thought this was a significant advance in human affairs, and in any case, irreversible. It was time for schools, he said, to adapt to reality. Dewey called this conversion underway, quote, the new individualism, with no trace of irony that I could detect. Part 4, get your filthy fingers off my brain. In the new reality, the ordinary American voice was disregarded. It was inefficient to listen to nobody. Common American voices were now collectivized, squeezed into something called public opinion. But public opinion was most often rigged. It was manufactured to suit the situation. It was almost never spontaneous. The colonization of the inner life of children especially, by strangers through forced schooling, is inherently so pornographic an undertaking that no nation historically had ever been able to compel people to accept it for very long. Not until the military state of Prussia, during the second decade of the 19th century, forced universal institutional schooling on its own people. Prussia was modeled deliberately after the ancient warrior state of Sparta. And Prussia cited national emergency in doing it. Privately, however, the real catalyst was not a national emergency, but an extremely negative assessment of the capabilities of ordinary people by the nation's foremost philosopher, a man named Johann Fichte, F-I-C-H-T-E. You can Google Mr. Fichte. Fichte wrote a dozen public demands on the King of Prussia to bring about exactly the kind of forced schooling you're familiar with. It's spread out over 6 years, I believe. But he wasn't the originator of these demands. He was echoing similar opinions rendered historically by the great liberal philosopher Spinoza in Holland, who said that people were so emotionally unstable and diseased, murderously so, that there was no cure for it. So there had to be forced schooling, which filled their heads with nonsense, so they never could think clearly, and set them against one another in competition to eliminate the danger. If you want to check on that particular Spinoza, because you will not find him in normal academic histories, you want to read a book called Tractatus Religico-Politicus, very slim volume. The Tractate, it's usually called by serious students of philosophy, in which Spinoza lays down the system that Fichte finally convinced the King of Prussia to impose on Prussia, and Horace Mann and a group of other American notables imported into the United States. So, Prussia was the first person to figure out a kind of engineering to deal with the degenerate common people, which no major Western philosopher in previous history had ever had a good word to say for it. Starting with Plato's Republic and the Laws, let me jump to Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, where Calvin invents forced schooling to fill people's heads with nonsense so that you could disregard them as serious opponents. But the real villain of the school piece is a man named Charles Darwin, one of the wealthiest men in European history. Your school books don't tell you that. A supremely wealthy man who didn't waste his time on people like us. He spoke to princes and dukes and heads of industry. He was on that inner circle around the British throne. And Mr. Darwin provided not a political, not a philosophic, not a militaristic or psychological reason to break ordinary people, but he provided a biological reason to do it. You recall that in his famous book, Origin of Species, it carries a subtitle, The Progress of the Favored Races. The Victorians used race slightly different than we did. The Irish were a race, for example. There were about 47 races there. Some were favored and some were disfavored. Biologically, notice that makes the term education meaningless. If there's no possibility of improving the biology, what does education mean? I'll tell you what it means. It means training your habits and your attitudes, conditioning them so you become predictable, manageable, and your danger is reduced. Your danger to the leadership. So Darwin's Origin of Species introduced the idea scientifically, but it was his second major book, Descent of Man, which I guarantee you will be available in every library in Oregon. How's that? I've not been in one library in Oregon ever. It will be in every library in the United States of any pretension to being a serious place. Descent of Man says emphatically that the human race is not evolving. A small fragment of the human race, maybe 10%, is evolved. Everybody else is evolutionary deadwood. And here comes the kicker. If the good breeding stock crossbreeds with the bad breeding stock, I think he gives the example of a dashing Italian actually winning the heart of some Scandinavian beauty. Evolution will turn around and march backwards into the swirling mists of the dawnless past. Now that's pretty serious stuff. And if you recall that Darwin wasn't sitting on a platform like this, but he was dropping this wisdom in drawing rooms and in the parties of the powerful. If you were a responsible human being and you thought there was a menace to the human race, of bad biology crossbreeding with good biology, would you not, I think, wouldn't it be incumbent on you morally to find a way to keep them apart? And since Calvin had already instructed the upper classes of Europe that there were so many people who were damned at birth by the Lord, about 9 out of 10, you couldn't actually tell these people back to your place because they would overwhelm you. You had to have an intricate mechanism where they would put themselves, they would lock themselves into a mental, character, behavioral prison. So what we got out of Darwin's first powerful effusion was a series of elite private boarding schools, not day schools, boarding schools, where you could store the good biological stuff. Now those had existed before in European history, but almost none of them existed. The whole United States had 6 of these places, not enough to store the good biology away from the bad stuff. So in the 2 decades after Darwin published Descent of Man, there was an explosion of elite private boarding schools. Almost all of the top ones, like Groton or St. Paul's or Hotchkiss, and Exeter and Andover, like the Macy's and Gimbels of those places. The top places were subsidized by some industrial fortune. J.P. Morgan was the money behind Kent, and we could go on, but I think the point makes itself. Now what you're left with, though, is how to keep the lid on all this bad biology running around with the American traditions, the libertarian, free thinking, this is a free country, free speech, all that nonsense. How are you going to get rid of it? The parents won't sit still for it, especially the Irish parents, and Darwin had condemned the Irish race as the worst of the worst. They were so biologically degraded, 10 million years you're the Irish. I couldn't make this up. So how have you and I arrived at this stage in our lives? We never even heard of these things. Well, because we're taught overtly and covertly, why waste your time reading the original documents? You read a secondary document, and it tells you what Darwin said, or doesn't. Anyway, so back to schooling. Darwin's first cousin, a man named Francis Galton, who earlier IQ experts said had the largest intelligence in human history, took upon himself the holy mission of spreading Darwinism, the protection against the disfavored races, through schooling. And he came to the United States several times, and he anointed leaders here. And there were Galtonian associations all over the country working behind the scenes to see to it that we put up good prisons everywhere for the ordinary people. I want to tell you a personal story about Galton. I've given about 1,300 presentations in every American state in 13 foreign countries, and only twice have I been attacked from the audience. That doesn't mean the audiences aren't critical of what I say or they don't have minds of their own, but twice an audience member stood up and denounced me in the middle of the talk, and on both occasions, once in Santa Cruz in California, and once in an elite accountant's office on Madison Avenue in New York City. I was denounced. Both times I had mentioned Galton in this critical way. I brought him to you. The first person who attacked me was the son of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman. The second time I was attacked was by a very famous speculator whose book is called Memoirs of a Speculator. I'm sorry his name eludes me right now. So the religious quality, intensity of Galtonian fervor against the underclasses is alive and well and living among us now, though the people don't wear a badge on their sleeves, so that you know that about that. Horace Mann's own writings occur in nearly the same zone of time as Darwin's, and they hint at darker aspects of the school project. Mann sold compulsion schooling to his wealthy backers as, quote, the best police, close quote, they could buy. It was a much different, less romantic message than he was selling to ordinary householders in Massachusetts. And as I told you before we officially started, he once jotted a note to himself while watching a working man's parade in Boston saying, "We must find a way to break the bonds of association among the working classes." Mann's high praise of Prussian schooling, with which he claimed eyewitness experience, played an important part in bringing the compulsion system to Massachusetts. But his claim of first-hand knowledge was a lie. He had no such experience, nor was it Mann's only lie. Forced schooling turned out from the beginning to be a breeding ground for crime and public outrage, not the best police, as he promised. Small wonder that Daniel Webster himself denounced Horace Mann in the Congressional Record, another curious page of history, never, never, never taught in government schools. The groundwork for our own forced schooling was laid during the British takeover of India in the late 18th century. During that period, the secrets of successful school management for the masses were discovered to reside in 8 constituents employed by the Hindu aristocracy to manage its common population. And here are the 8 at work, and then I'll give you the provenance so that you can verify this for yourself. In place of skills training, rote memory drills. In place of exercises to develop independent judgment, habit and attitude training. Strict limits on student questioning. Strict limits on student-to-student associations. Silent testing of material previously assigned for memorization, followed by publicly announced rankings of student test results, and this done regularly. These are the Hindu way to control the Indian underclass. Denial of any student right to initiate curriculum based on personal interest. Long-term confinement in conditions of near immobility and enforced silence extending over a term of years. And finally, the removal of students from familiar surroundings, routines, and people, placement under the direction of strangers who discourage attempts to build personal student-teacher relationships. Now, how did this transfer from India into England and Germany and other places? Well, the recipe for doing this was written down by a British military chaplain named Alexander Bell, who published a version of it in London in 1797 as the methodology and used by Hindu elites to manage the huge population of India. Bell thought such a discipline might prove useful to Britain's own class-driven social order. Seldom has a single short essay had such lasting influence on world history. In a short time, Bell's words were being read in governing circles all across the world as far away as Japan. Upon reading Mr. Bell, a 20-year-old Quaker, Joseph Lancaster, took Bell's suggestions to heart and began teaching a class of over 1,000 poor children to read, all by himself. in an alley next to his London home. You see, the Hindu method allowed a single teacher to manage huge numbers of pupils by dividing the total group into student-led subunits. The leaders bore the title monitor, and hence Lancaster's system was referred to as the monitorial method. Except for the spectacularly high student-teacher ratio, it was driven by a perfectly sound principle: children teach children, just like the system at work in America's one-room schools. But the vast scale difference and its mind-deadening formula extended the gulf between students and official teachers. It made mental colonization almost a certainty. The monitorial system created subordinates, psychologically and behaviorally conditioned to remain subordinate. Argumentation was non-existent. The active literacies of persuasive speech and writing were rigorously avoided. Napoleon's idea that every common soldier should be able to think like a field marshal, that was an ideal cherished in America's populist tradition, was antithetical to the purposes of monitorial schooling. But youthful Mr. Lancaster, the Quaker, knew nothing of such ulterior motives. He was driven innocently by a simple desire to do good while winning fame and fortune. He concentrated on the pure mechanics of reading well by teaching the alphabet system that we today call phonics, but it's ancient. He personalized training as much as circumstances allowed. Because he did those things, rather than concentrate on memory drills and testing, his rapidly spreading system threatened for a time to upset the apple cart of state-sponsored mass training, which always aims at imposing order on a society through an elaborate scheme of divide and conquer subordination. Something had to be done before the ordinary people burst out of their containers through mental development, and the official state church of Britain did it. In response to Lancaster's do-goodism, the Anglicans opened a competing chain of Hindu schools whose intention was indoctrination, not education, just like the Hindu originals. Anglican prestige drove Lancaster's rough-edged competition from the field. He fled to America in 1818, where under the patronage of powerful men like DeWitt Clinton, he opened Lancaster schools in virtually every large city east of the Mississippi. But under the stewardship of the entrepreneurs selected to run these schools, who were, after all, out to make a buck, the schools were heavily influenced by local elites, and American monitorial schooling regressed back to the original mean very quickly, adopting the Hindu control design. That pleased local families of substance much more than Lancaster's innocent alternative, actually teaching common children to acquire formidable skills. One important byproduct of the Lancaster phenomenon was that it offered practical evidence that mass indoctrination of the young through school schemes could work, even in liberty-loving America. And as I told you, the first nation to follow this promising trail to its logical end was the military state of Prussia. By 1820, Prussia had a forced schooling system up and running. Its purpose to convert the young into human resources. That's a translation of a German phrase. You may have heard it recently. We have a Department of Human Resources, I believe, in Washington. Powers of expression were suppressed through schooling. Information needed to think in context was denied, and the young were forced daily to compete with one another for status and dignity. This was the very system Horace Mann asked America to imitate. And imitate it we did, though not with the same zeal, for another half century. Whig movers and shakers like Horace Mann and his influential Unitarian backers were able to impose their will on only 2 states, Massachusetts and New York, in the early 1850s. To that short list, however, a fatal third jurisdiction must be added, our national government center, Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. Washington was the straw that broke the national back of education. It's certain our school institution would look much different than it does today, were it not for Washington offering material incentives behind the scenes to convince individual state decision makers to play ball and accept the Prussian model. It's fairly easy to demonstrate that centralized compulsion schooling was never part of the democratic American dream or its Republican counterpart. Not a single word about schooling, not a single word appears in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration, or in any one of the nation-building debates recorded in the Federalist Papers, which, by the way, used to be read in every junior high school in America until I guess somebody got the idea that it might not be a wise thing to do to have kids say, well, how do we get schools? They're not mentioned here. Jefferson, however, had heard of a movement to do this in Europe, a movement which drew its inspiration from Benedict Spinoza's Tractatus Religico-Politicus of 1690. Some of you have had some philosophic training. May wonder why I didn't say Baruch Spinoza, and it's for the simple reason that not a single time in his life did Spinoza ever sign his name Baruch Spinoza. Not once. You might wonder how he became Baruch Spinoza then. It certainly would be a key to understanding the whole hall of mirrors that you and I are involved in. So Spinoza sought to establish a system of forced schooling in Holland to replace faith-based religion, which he despised. But Jefferson rejected this idea to bamboozle common men and women, calling it, quote, a mere civil religion, precisely the locution Spinoza employed in the tractate. Nor was there any local popular clamor for institutional schooling after our revolution. You don't need to take my word for it. Pick up a copy of a book that will be in every library in Oregon called Democracy in America by the French aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville. And Tocqueville says emphatically that history has never seen a common people so superbly educated as in America without any formal system of schooling at all, with thousands of schools following every pattern imaginable. But there were no systematic schooling, and most people didn't go to any of the 1,000 schools. George Washington for 2 years, Benjamin Franklin for 2 years, etc. I think Jefferson for no years. So, as I told you in the prequel to this, the Tractate of Spinoza, published in 1690, available in university libraries. You might be able to Google it also. Denounced common people as hopelessly irrational, and they had to be put to sleep mentally in order to protect the best people. That's the liberal philosopher Spinoza you may have studied in college. Now that you've heard a few of the philosophical rationales to justify what happened, I want to give you some hard-nosed economic justifications. I'll be very surprised if you've ever heard of these before, even though for a long period of time on the upper levels of policymakers in the country, they were prime items to problems to be solved. Most obvious of these is the easiest to understand. This new institution would offer a rich field of personal opportunity for the ambitious. As the largest hiring agency in America, it could bestow lucrative contracts. It was a spectacular economic engine right from the start, a jobs project with no civilian parallel. Its material aspect hidden behind a cloud of treacly rhetoric about educating children. School performed subtler economic services as well by offering breaks from motherhood. It allowed millions of women to be drawn into the labor pool. Right. Well, from the boss's point of view, that cut the economic value of each labor unit in half. And so, Johns Hopkins in 1988 published a study saying that the average income of an American working man in 1908 required a working couple in 1988 to duplicate the purchasing power. Just what you would expect if you ever had been taught the ABCs of economics. If you double the size of a labor force, you cut the unit value in half. You can set these people against one another, competing for work. So school performed subtler services as well, and the subtlest of all, I'm going to tell you about next. Well, first I'll tell you about, it created the industry of teacher training, whose customers had no choice but to buy the service if they wanted access to one of these new jobs. But now, the greatest subtlety. All these things by themselves guaranteed that school training would be everlastingly political. Nobody who benefits materially from politicized schooling, who gets the chalk contract or the liberal contract or whatever, whether they're from the left or right of the center, would be crazy enough to allow schools to be depoliticized. The tidal flow of money through school corridors in good times and in bad is, in the last analysis, much more important than philosophy as an ultimate determinant of school affairs. Now what I've been promising you the subtle reasons to do this. There are two fatal diseases that infect capitalism on a regular basis. One is called overproduction, and the other is called hyperdemocracy. Let me give you a couple of samples of each. All through the 19th century, there were financial crises. Each one of those crises was caused by the fact that the American dream was to produce your own life and enough in surplus that you could get an income from that. So no business was safe from being imitated, duplicated, and it would lose the pricing power of its stuff. There had to be a way to make the American population less productive. In 1991, an economic crisis spread all over Asia. It was generated by Japanese banks who had a huge amount of surplus money sitting around, and they lent it out at favorable interest rates all over Asia, and a crisis of overproduction occurred. The famous microloans of the Grameen Bank, and of course, they're a wonderful thing in theory and in practice. And yet, if a village can support one rickshaw driver, and there are loans enough to get two ambitious young fellows rickshaws of their own, now the village has 3 rickshaw drivers. There isn't enough business to support them. They all go belly up. And if housewives are encouraged to open micro groceries out of their kitchens in a village of 500, you might end up with 50 little grocery stores, and they all go belly up. That's the Asian economic crisis of the 1990s. It was very, very, very intense. It was caused by overproduction because the Japanese banks had surplus income to loan. I'm not discouraging micro loans here. Don't think that for a second. I'm saying that these issues are sophisticated, and what you're never given by journalism or schooling are the pieces to move around and say, this is a complex problem. So I'll give you one other example of, I'll give you 2 examples of overproduction. I'll give you an example of hyperdemocracy, which means there are too many people who want to be heard in the marketplace of ideas. In 1964 or 5, the young people of the United States couldn't be heard in the legislatures, couldn't be heard by journalism. They turned out in the streets and they shut down an extremely prosperous war that we were engaged in, because that's the way our diseased economy lurches from decade to decade. We can't live without a war. If you take seriously that a mysterious organization named Al-Qaeda is a menace to the United States, doesn't have an army, doesn't have a navy, doesn't have an air force, and its maximum high-tech attacks are based on blowing up your underwear or your shoes, or a bomb in Times Square that smokes for half an hour before it goes off. If that's what they can do, and that's the justification for bankrupting our country and our own domestic needs, then we're pretty far gone as far as saying, yeah, well, we're in this crisis situation. God knows they could send a million people home to blow their underwear up. So that's hyperdemocracy at work. I learned that by reading the various essays issued by a group called the Trilateral Commission. And in 1975, it published a book, NYU Press, and the sponsor, called Crisis of Democracy. Imagine my surprise when the crisis turned out to be if people actually believe that anyone wants to hear their opinion, there's a crisis of management in the country. So, institutional schooling provides a partial remedy for these two diseases. And in order to get rid of overproduction, what it targets is the imagination. The imagination is what allows Dave Albert to see that the provider of X service or Y material has forgotten something. And he supplies it cheaper or better, or he's the only one offering it. And this whole economic pyramid collapses. So if the imagination can be neutralized, weakened, marginalized by making art and music, etc., making these things luxuries that have to be cut back in time of economic emergency, and there's always one in schools, right? Then what we've done is diminish. If we pay off big for memorizing what you're told to memorize, but we're made uneasy by someone who creates a new way to see, kids over 12 years span of confinement, they pick up on what's being rewarded and what isn't. As bizarre as I know it sounds, under corporate capitalism and corporate governance, ways must be found to make the general public less productive and less self-reliant. And school is the mechanism to do that. A look at the marijuana economy will reveal clearly some of the distortions to everyday life which result from trying to avoid overproduction. Pot is easy and inexpensive to grow. If it were legal to do so, as it was when George Washington was growing it, the commercial market would be ruined. Anti-marijuana policy is unmistakably the best friend the illegal drug industry has. In the real world of self-interest, huge sums constantly flow from the illegal drug industry into the hands of its nominal enemies. And I'm not doubting their sincerity. They are the enemy. But huge amounts of money come from the growing of drugs and end up in the hands of the people who denounce liberal legislation because the industry must keep the business illegal. Otherwise, anyone can do it. Common sense should tell you this must be so unless the criminal drug cartels are absolute fools. The beneficiaries of this largesse need not be aware of this dynamic at work. They need only persist in their anti-drug efforts to fulfill their end of the bargain, which prevents overproduction of the crop. You probably can tell from that passage that I had some training at the hands of Jesuits. A second disease menacing corporate capitalism, but I've already told you about that, about hyperdemocracy. If hyperdemocracy were ever allowed to take root, as it almost did under Ross Perot's candidacy, all the comfortable arrangements where the SEC is allowed to watch pornography instead of watching over the bank, things like that. All those comfortable arrangements would be in jeopardy. But what if Thomas Hobbes' war of all against all was deliberately reenacted in classrooms daily with the full approval of school authority? Wouldn't the involuntary competitors eventually become reluctant or even incapable of productive cooperation? And what if you physically divided the young from one another by age, by social class, by neighborhood, by endless segregations into groups of winners and losers? Wouldn't all this division do the trick of discouraging cooperation, thus sidestepping the prospect of hyper-democracy? School conditions its subjects so thoroughly in games of winning and losing, petty games that have no importance at all. Notice that on an important game, like learning to drive, everybody wins, even though we jeopardize one another's safety and our lives on a daily basis. If grades and test scores were actually to provide useful information, wouldn't every car have a flashing sign saying she almost failed the driving test 3 times? Don't you have a right to know how good the driver is? We all pass for one good reason. The country is widely dispersed. Businesses couldn't survive if you couldn't hop into the car and drive 10 blocks to get a pack of cigarettes or whatever it is that you smoke. I don't do that. So anyway, so school conditions its subject so thoroughly in games of winning and losing that the deeper purpose of learning becomes peripheral. Winning is the point of the school enterprise, not gaining enlightenment, not developing skill, not gaining insight. Winning for no reason beyond personal advantage has been known through human history to be a trivial and ultimately a meaningless achievement. It's like taking snuff in order to sneeze. What's that about? Under a regimen that demands that we sort boys and girls into winners and losers, what is won never stays won. Victories must be repeated over and over until the victor wears out and another winner is crowned. Nor does it take into account that winners at school tests are very frequently losers at life. Does that fall on your ears as a strange idea? I mean, we've known that for a century. The A students aren't the best readers, they're not the best counters, they're certainly not the best inventors. Our major politicians are by and large C students. Our major CEOs of great corporations are by and large C students. Where do I get that information? How about a study of every graduate of Columbia University, undertaken by Columbia University, published in 1960, I think, called They Went to College. Only in the ministry do A students rise to the top. I wouldn't even pretend to explain why that would be so. In business, it's the C+ students that rise to the top. In science, it's the B students that rise to the top. Surely you know that Franklin Roosevelt, a C student in high school and a C student in college, just like John F. Kennedy, a C student in high school and a C student in college, Just like George Bush, that wouldn't be a surprise, right? A C student in high school and a C student in college, but a higher C student than John Kerry, who he ran against and beat for the presidency. They all know a phrase that I'd be very surprised if any of you have ever heard before, called the gentleman's C. I discovered that when I was in junior high school in a book about my idol, Franklin Roosevelt. And there were some glossy pictures in the middle of the book. One was a letter he had written home to Hyde Park, boasting from Harvard that he had achieved the gentleman's C. I was about 13 or 14 when I read that. It wasn't until I was in my 40s that I was able, and I really rigorously tried to find out what on earth that could mean. Simply means this: the gentleman, and that doesn't mean people who hold the lady's chair, the gentlemen who are part of the managerial circle understand that schooling is a hall of mirrors, and that to waste your time getting anything more than a C marks you as inferior, not superior. On the other hand, you get worse than a C, jeopardizes the integrity of this control institution. So the C is like winking your eye and saying, hey, I'm not a boat rocker, I understand the game. They're all C students. Or did you know that? In fact, some of them, the two creators of the Human Genome Project. One's Francis Collins, and the other one, somebody. The other major guy.
Watson and Crick.
No. Watson and Crick are the DNA discoverer. Human Genome Project. The reason it's important is that the first name I mentioned, Francis S. Collins, was homeschooled on a remote sheep ranch in Western Virginia with no curriculum, no time limits on what he studied at all, no constraints whatsoever, except his mother imposed this rule. There were 4 brothers, all different ages, and they all had to agree what the collective study investment would be, and they all had to agree when they had enough of that to leap to something else. That's him. The other guy was a D student from a high school in San Diego. He just published his autobiography 3 months ago. I would urge you to read it, except I can't give you his name. He was only a D student because he was such a rotten human being. The teachers raised his failing marks because they didn't want to coexist with him for another year. And did he go to Harvard? No, he didn't. He was taken in the Army as a buck private, and he ended up as a medical corps man in Vietnam, patching up sucking chest wounds and similar events. Those were the creators of the Human Genome Project. Every business on planet Earth is lined up to get rich, taking discoveries from human genome. But shouldn't they have had test tubes from age 1 and be carefully brought along? Why? If you know anything about the history of science, this is how all the great developments are made. Read a book by an MIT professor called Discovery. His name is Robert Scott Root-Bernstein. And it's simply a very thick book. It simply deals with the mental processes that lead to breakthrough discoveries, exposing the secrets of nature. And one thing is pretty uniform. You take a creative scientific mind, you surround it with assistants, lab equipment, a budget, That's it. It dries up and has to do what most of the scientists you ever heard of do. They steal the work from their graduate students and publish it under their own name. That having this, cutting an ice cube tray into shapes, you know, and thinking, what am I going to do for this chemical or that chemical, apparently fuels this creative breakout from conventional thinking that leads you to the discoveries. Now then what happens is some great institution sucks the discovery in, gets government money, corporate money, foundation money, and it gets the imprimatur of Caltech put on it. Rediscovering. He's a pretty well thought of physicist at MIT who wrote it. So competition, except one kind, destroys your ability to associate and combine successfully with other people because they're your rivals. The one exception to that, which I think is the key to a successful life. There are a lot of keys, but I think without this, you never can sustain, in good times and bad, a successful life. You have to compete against the mediocre part of yourself. You have to be able to see that the work you put out, that they stamp A+, is very mediocre work, and you copied the middle section of some Austrian website, you know, or whatever. If you constantly compete against yourself, you're never content. You're always trying to find the boundaries of your own possibility. And even at 75, it's so exciting to do that there just isn't a dull moment, nor do you need much of anything to sustain a pure kind of happiness. Buffett had his first lucrative business at age 6. By the time he was 13, he had 5 streams of revenue pouring into his depression pocket. But attempting to win against faithless others inspires you to cheat to gain the system. So why should you follow Buffett's road to wealth when Bernie Madoff's is so much easier to follow? Why strive to emulate Babe Ruth when Barry Bonds' chemical success is much more reliable? The classroom version of performance-enhancing drugs is cheating and sucking up to the instructor. It teaches you nothing. Just so, competing for grades and praise forecloses lifelong, lasting rewards, which only learning for its own sake can bestow. Competition was selected by the canny Prussian school designers to divide the young against one another, to pit their parents against the other kids' parents. Divided people are easiest to manage. Caesar's Gallic Wars, which I read in 6th grade in a coal mining town, was once a standard secondary school textbook that illustrated this principle. But although it's very well written and very interesting to teenagers, and it's still a staple in elite private schooling, it has vanished entirely from public schools. I think this is the last part. It's called As a Vampire Fears Garlic, the marketplace fears wisdom. Well-schooled populations are usually trained to pay lip service to democracy. At the same time, they're being conditioned to avoid the attitudes and behaviors democracy requires. It's a dilemma without an easy answer, because while our national consciousness honors the idea of democratic society, our national economy and our government would wither and die under anything less than a command and control reality. Would you teach critical judgment and moral behavior to everybody? Tell me something, if you would. How could an economy like ours, grounded in the global sale of war machinery, industrially produced meat, fruit, and vegetables, which has a nutritional value about half of what farm products had in 1940, that relies on financial trickery and the mass sale of magical programs of schooling, not all of them inside schools? How could an economy like this endure in a climate of critical intelligence? When I was growing up during World War II in a coal mining town near Pittsburgh, the general ability to debate abstract concepts such as overproduction, hyperdemocracy, and divide and conquer politics was much, much more widespread among ordinary people than I have ever seen in New York City in the lofty academic precincts of Columbia University. A vivid memory I carry from 65 years ago is one of the favorite games of the snot-nosed kids I ran with, who would huddle near the open doors of the town saloon so we could overhear conversations among miners and mill workers drinking at the bar. Their discussions, which you might fairly call shouting matches, were richly laced with ideas in conflict. And they were of the same high caliber as the conversations I heard on the bocce courts at the Italian Club on Main Street, or in the bowling alley, where I set pins for a dime a game. Now that might fall on your ears as hyperbole. So your very first assignment, if you're serious about this, is to read E.P. Thompson's classic account of working class intelligentsia in 19th century Britain, passionately striving for a life of the mind and for the training necessary to express their ideas clearly and forcefully. This was an appetite, I should add, which the better classes took vigorous steps to shut down. The book I'm recommending to you is entitled The Making of the English Working Class. It had to be made. It didn't exist naturally. Remember those 10-year-old boys building racing yachts and cutting new entrances for their homes? I never did those things, but I made several soapbox racers from similar plans in 1945 when I was 10, and I built a rubber band-driven P-51 Mustang that could fly 4 city blocks at respectable altitudes, and furthermore, every 10-year-old I knew did things like that in working class Monongahela, Pennsylvania, before modern pedagogical principles were applied to its schools. At Xavier Academy, the Jesuit boarding school, where I was sequestered for 1 year in 1943, 1944, we learned fundamental algebra in 3rd grade and studied dialectics in 4th grade. Then returning to public school in the coal mining town, I read Caesar, Marcus Aurelius, John Milton, Shakespeare in a common 7th grade class. And in 9th grade, I got the option to read the Latin writers again in Latin. Today, all that stuff, including the freelance building projects, are looked upon as child abuse. But no working class kid I knew would have agreed. It was so exciting to grow a powerful mind Nobody had to browbeat us much to do it. And if that sounds too radical for you to swallow, I'm going to prescribe 2 very short autobiographies that should not only cure your skepticism, but make you choke if the standard of quality you're familiar with is public schooling. The first is the autobiography of John Stuart Mill, and the second is the autobiography of Norbert Wiener. Wiener is regarded as the grandfather of the computer revolution, and Mill, I hope, needs no introduction. At birth, both their fathers, certifiable lunatics, deliberately set out to make their sons geniuses without benefit of a single day of school instruction, and both succeeded in this aim. I think almost anybody could if they were as crazy as Father Mill and Father Wiener. The precise details and blueprints they followed are in these short autobiographies. But I warn you in advance, if you could be shocked by 10-year-olds melting toothbrush handles to make glue, upon learning that 5-year-old kids can master Chinese and Greek and a modern Romance language and begin the heavy study of advanced mathematics. And where do you see what they did at 8? The ancient Chinese imperial strategy, known as, quote, the policy of keeping the people dumb, was adopted by Hindu India and by Prussia, and from there it spread far and wide, eventually reaching America through Germany. In 1922, the then nationally famous New York City mayor, John Holland, he was spoken of as the next Republican candidate for president, said in a speech that the schools in his city, quote, had been seized as an octopus would seize its prey, and that the schools were wrapped in the, quote, tentacles of an invisible creature acting through the great private foundations of Carnegie and Rockefeller. You could say things like that in 1922. By the end of World War II, nobody who worried about an academic career would dare say a word seriously critical of the real power which manages institutional schooling. And no newspaper would if it wanted to keep its advertising base. After all, school administrators and politicians are only flunkies. They're front men in the school game. And woe betide any reckless traitor who invites the public behind the scenery to see how the school illusion is manufactured. And in conclusion, the conclusion will take another 7.5 minutes. You've been very patient. This part's called Who Cares About Performance? Early schooling in colonial America aimed at creating desirable skills like expression, the arts of association, concentration, imagination, cooperation, good manners, and the potent active literacies of persuasive speaking and writing. The descendant form that we're familiar with stresses memorizing detached bits of information said to be necessary to learn abstract categories of intellect called subjects. What subjects actually are, or what they're for, no teacher hired in America could tell you, no school administrator could tell you. But subjects are what schools teach, only accidentally, to do they teach skill? Notice that skills training cannot be tested by paper pencil examinations, only by performance. Subjects, however, demand passive tested memory. Whether those memories can ever be applied to something useful is never an issue that matters one jot or one tittle to any school. Nobody with an ounce of common sense. This is a challenge to you. And if you've ever contradicted what I'm going to charge you with, then you're absolutely at liberty to say nothing he said should be taken seriously. Nobody with an ounce of common sense asks for test scores when hiring. You do not ask your barber, your grass cutter, your babysitter, your doctor, your lawyer, or your architect for their test numbers, because on some level you know the data is absolutely worthless, however many tens of billions of dollars it takes to produce. As the 21st century concludes its first decade, mass schooling, as much as it was in 1910, and certainly that way for the poor and the ordinary, it's test-driven, bell-driven, pedagogue-dominated, and thoroughly dumbed down. I'd be surprised if you know that the term pedagogue, or the umbrella term pedagogy, are labels borrowed from the ancient Mediterranean world, where they designated a specialized form of slave and that particular slavery, respectively. Do you find those survivals curious? Do you think they endured over thousands of years by accident? School is the great disconnector. It disconnects children from the working community, where a variety of styles and techniques are on display for study. It disconnects them from family relationships, from valuable neighborhood associations. It disconnects them from one another and distances them from their own inner lives. Our first National Commissioner of Schooling, William Torrey Harris, wrote that school, quote, must give training in self-alienation, a task best undertaken in dark, airless corridors, in preference to cheerful surroundings. He wrote that in his book, Philosophy of Education, published in 1906. You could, as they say, look it up. Standardized schooling by force is not even remotely about education. It's about the same things in America that it was about in ancient China, Hindu India, and Prussia. The Germanized version of the instrument focuses on converting individuals into a mass population for the ease of managing them. Once we had a national entrepreneurial culture, and in such a culture, that's Lincoln saying we all have independent livelihood. Personal sovereignty is an absolute blessing. But in a corporate culture, it's a curse. Corporate logic demands the young be rendered radically incomplete to the end of converting them into human resources and consumption machines. Nearly all work in our society now has been centralized. To pull this transformation off, children in bulk have to be taught to think of their future in terms of jobs instead of independent livelihood. And I told you about Lincoln's speech. Jobs are for serfs and slaves. And that was a common American understanding in 1850. But the great waves of immigration brought to these shores had to have those independent attitudes broken before they took hold. Parents were taught to accept lifelong subordination, not as a curse, but as a freedom from burdensome responsibility, taught to turn their children over to anonymous agents of the political state as further freedom from responsibility. You can't imagine how many, I'll say women, I was about to say parents, have said to me in the 19 years I've been traveling all over the planet, asking about homeschooling, and say, are those people crazy to want to spend that much time with their own children? So, the new economy, which was built by Carnegie and Rockefeller, Astor, Vanderbilt, Harriman, a few other men, not many more, drenched America with pro-school propaganda. They bought up every newspaper and journal of importance to assist in the project of colonizing the public mind. The way they influenced the immigrant press, including famous representatives of the immigrant press, like the Jewish daily Foreword, to get them on the side of this project, was simply to extend or withhold advertising, which in a marginal business operation is life and death. You know, I got that fact from a footnote or a long back note in the back of John Higgins' magnificent book about immigration called Strangers in the Land. During a court trial in 1920, testimony to the effect of corporations buying off the immigrant press came out, was recorded, and Higgins, disinterred it from the graveyard of, of the files, and breathtaking. In short order, these people convinced us that seat time in school was equivalent to education, even though their own laws showed no commitment to school confinement at all. Rockefeller and Carnegie went into factory work rather than go to school. Carnegie begged his parents at age 7 not to waste his time in schooling, and he became a thread winder in a garment factory. But when he was 11, because he was out in the world, he had his ears open, he heard that the railroads, which were the Microsoft of their day, were looking for crackerjack telegraph operators. When he wasn't winding thread, he was practicing. He submitted himself to the Pennsylvania Railroad at the age of 12. They hired him on the spot by performance, not by his grades in telegraphy. He demonstrated he was better than anyone they had, and by the time he was 19, he was the partner of the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He had a Scottish accent so thick that he was a constant figure of derision. He never had the money to buy a sandwich. No patron stepped forward, but he, very much like a long list of people you can read about if you buy my weapons of mass instruction, like the CEO of the RCA Corporation, figured out what the layout was and put themselves in the way of opportunity. And your kids can do that today as long as they follow sterling examples like Michael Dell, who didn't go to college, like Bill Gates, who didn't go to college, like Steve Jobs, who didn't go to college, like Ted Turner, who didn't go to college, like the founder of the Whole Foods market, who didn't go to college, I could keep you here for a whole day. How come someone hasn't bothered to tell you this? Don't they know it? Okay, at this point, I'm not going to tell you about the Bartleby Project, which was what I'd recommend if you have kids or nieces and nephews in school. When the standardized test is set before you, right on the front of the test, I would prefer not to take this test. Just as Herman Melville's brilliant office clerk began to say to the boss when he said, go to the post office and get the mail Bartleby, I would prefer not to do that. He didn't yell, he didn't scream. He asserted his right to affirmations and denials. And that story deviled me all my life. And a couple of years ago, I figured out just what it meant. Now it's your turn. How about tough questions? Spitballs the word. A tough question.
What was it that caused you to make your resignation in the Wall Street Journal in the first place?
Okay, I resigned in 1991. I think it was July 15th on the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal. But they decided to publish it then. I had sent the article in January or February. I'd reached the end of the line, not the end of my patience, but by working on a daily basis to sabotage the system by providing the raw material of an education to as many students whose mothers allowed it. As I always say, it's the mothers. I had achieved a certain notoriety where visitors would come to see what on earth I was doing, that my ghetto kids were winning all the speaking and essay competitions in New York City that were set aside for Bronx Science and Stuyvesant students. What were these little black and brown kids from Harlem and Spanish Harlem doing, standing up before the city council and asking that a bill to keep public swimming pools at the top of the priority list? Well, how were they able to do that? So, one way they were able to do that is that I made a standing offer to, I had about 120 students a day, and I said, you have the right at any time, as long as you're polite, to say, why are we doing this? And you'll be able to tell, in a lot of clues I'll give in my answer, whether I actually know why we're doing it and I believe in it, or whether I'm doing it to stay out of trouble with the school administrator. In the latter case, I said, you have the right to opt out politely and go anywhere in New York City and get an education for yourself, once your mom agrees. But I had already lined up virtually all the moms, so we were in cahoots. What happened was the fame, not that I got, that the kids got. There was always this guy Gatto in this ghetto school. What was going on? Well, I couldn't tell people what was going on because it was illegal. It wasn't just not forbidden, it was illegal to do these things. I'd send kids age 12 and 13 alone on the bus hundreds of miles away to drop in on the head of the state senate and find out what he was doing to earn his money, things like that. I would send kids to study the security arrangement at various institutions in New York City to learn how to penetrate places where school kids were forbidden to go. If I tell you we were never caught, now I'd give them a few class lessons. I would say one of the ways they know you're a kid and not a student teacher from a local college is you grin too much, you make jokes, you have bad posture, you slouch, you eat a sandwich. I said, what you have to do, is to act like somebody who's got some clout and authority. They won't know the difference. You can get into these fancy auctions at Park Burnett where $10 million paintings are being auctioned off. Otherwise, the guard spots you and turns you away. You can get into the sub-treasury building where all the used currency in the eastern part of America is in these huge glass cases and it's burned in furnaces. And most of the gold we have is down there, bar after bar. Or you could start a business on school time. Or as one kid did, now this was the record, out of 185 school days, he only attended school 7 days. What was he doing the other 178 days? He and I and his mother had worked out a project for him to study how to crack his way into a daytime soap opera. I think it was General Hospital, but it was one of those things, and he put himself in touch with actors. That's when he hung out in the drugstores where the soap opera actors hung out. He figured out how to do it, and he ended the school year not with a steady gig, but he got bit work on the soap operas. Once I was uncovered, I didn't have the maneuvering room any longer. I had to be able to read the morning paper, see an opportunity, and out of the 120 kids, know pretty well who could do it with profit and handle it, or ask for volunteers. That's not legal to do that. You got to get signed off by a number of levels of authority. So I picked the Wall Street Journal because I said if any general circulation population is not under the thumb of the school institution, as I knew the New York Times was, it'll be the Wall Street Journal. Sure enough, I quit, I think. They published it with a jerky title. I may be a school teacher, but I'm not an educator. If you ever studied logic, as I know Dave Albert did, you'll know that the term educator itself is a measure of the uncritical consciousness you bring to the business. It's in logic known as begging the question. You don't know whether someone's an educator, nor can they arrogate that title to themselves. You do know they're a school teacher because it says that on their license. But an educator, who could tell you whether someone was an educator? I think only the people who had passed under his or her management, and only years after they got out would they suddenly be able to track successful parts of their attitude, their behavior, their intelligence to the person who opened that door for them. So I never allow myself to use the term. And I do think that making a sharp distinction between schooling, which is what you do to fish, and education, which nobody can do for you. It isn't conceivably possible that someone can educate you. You can determine to educate yourself, and then a lot of people can be useful to you. Without that commitment and that energy and that investment, you'll emerge well-schooled. But you'll fool a lot of people because they're well-schooled too. You write your own script for the most part. Every day, every week, every month, every year. Do you know that the arc of your life, at any moment, the arc of your life. You can see all the past, and you can make guesses about the future. Start your kids if they're 5 to 12 years old. Don't let a single day go by without reading a biography or an autobiography. The easiest way to do that is to get sources of good obituaries, because the whole arc of the life is set down in outline form. And by the time a kid digests a few hundred of those, they see that their own life, their own future is being made every day. It doesn't work for mommy or a school teacher to say that. You have to feel it. That the future is an extension of the past. There's no magic. You don't win a lottery. Or if you watch TV, there's no way that you don't have to pay the IRS what you owe them. So don't buy the program that tells you you can settle for 50 cents on the dollar, that you can settle for a quarter on the dollar for your credit card. You can only run ads like this to a country full of very ignorant people. Or that you can start speaking a foreign language in 10 minutes. Well, you don't know is that ad started 2 years ago with 7 minutes. And I guess somebody said, you know, we better make it a little more realistic. That went to 9 minutes, and now the ad that runs it, you can start speaking a foreign language in 10 minutes. As soon as you stiff the IRS and stiff your credit cards. I mean, we're in a lot of trouble. Could somebody ask a tough question in the back?
I don't know if it's tough, but what do you make of the fact that there seems to be more stories or publicity about unschooling in the mass media that kind of questions that it's not really about learning, that children don't learn any rules or morals or anything that will help them in life, and it's kind of this free-for-all? Do you see that as that really the numbers of unschoolers or homeschoolers is really starting to become a threat for the corporate kind of...
But the unschoolers are a threat to any settled interest. Corporations, museums, I mean, the churches. The unschooled are like fresh human beings. They're a fresh generation. Was unschooled people messing around in the laboratory, melting objects in an oven just to kill time, who saw a weird melt taking place, and as they tried to figure out why the object was melting that way, eventually came up with the double helix structure of DNA. That's Watson and Crick. The way things actually happen, if you were steeped in the way things actually happen, like a tea bag is in hot water, you would be a dangerous person. That you actually would be able to pick and choose experiences and raise the incidence of opportunity in your own life. I mean, how could a settled social order and a settled economy tolerate you? So initially, if you go back to the 1970s, enormous numbers of people were thrown into jail, and the kids taken and put in social work for homeschooling. What stopped that? And I hope I don't offend anybody here, because I have friends in the secular homeschooling world, and I have friends in the religious homeschooling world. But it was the intensely religious people who stopped the legal violation of homes by simply striking back with maximum force. And there's nothing a bureaucrat fears more than being confronted by someone who's determined to beat the bureaucratic rule. Because if the bureaucrat fails, which they will, because all they have is the cops and their paycheck to defend, the other people are acting out of principle. The bureaucrats have gotten rid of school superintendents, they're flunkies. I know the paper says this is a good one, it's a bad one. They're flunkies. If they don't do what they're told, they're given no wiggle room at all. Some of them have good hearts and good minds, and they sabotage the system. But God forbid they should do it for too many, so that the numbers generated by the system identify them as a source of infection, and they're gone. They'll never be hired anywhere else again. That works, by the way, for doctors too. I recently had some close association with a brilliant female doctor, black woman in Syracuse, New York, who had a large patient clientele with diabetes. And she knew that the standard treatments for diabetes did not work, were very expensive. And she, over the years, experimented and hit on several routines that aren't in the approved manual. Well, she doesn't have a medical license anymore, even though 100 of her patients appeared at the hearing saying that she eliminated the diabetes. Doesn't make any difference at all. You're jeopardizing enormous industries. When you do that, they're not going to tolerate it. So the only possible thing to do is to kill them. Well, certainly at my age, my imagination is exhausted, but not at yours. You know, you certainly keep resistance up. Sometimes you don't allow it to be seen. I always wore a dark blue pinstripe three-piece Brooks Brothers suit to junior high school. Everybody else dressed like a boy and a girl. I made sure my shoes were spit polished there. And the principal dressed like a boy too, and the assistant principals dressed like boys and girls. They didn't know how to deal with me. And I volunteered for all the dirty duty, like lunchroom duty, you know, and I screamed at kids in the hall, you know. But I was setting up a cover behind which, well, another question. Come on, yes, ma'am.
Was that from the get-go when you first got your license, or how long did it take?
Fortunately, it was from the get-go, not because I ever intended to be a school teacher. I was a hotshot advertising copywriter. You mean you've never seen the ad for Hanes Hosiery? Legs are in the limelight this year. You know, I was responsible for creating 50 words a month and sitting around drinking the day away, talking to people about adjectives. But unfortunately in advertising, if you lose the account, I was on the Colgate account, Colgate shaving cream, and our big push, this was 1960, I think. Our big push was Colgate shaving cream can even shave sandpaper. Now, the way we pulled that trick off was to scatter sand grains over a piece of glass, so your thumbnail could shave that kind of sandpaper. The FCC sent a team around to investigate. There were 250 employees sent out all over New York City to buy some incredibly cheap kind of sandpaper, maybe in Brooklyn, you know, that Colgate shaving cream could not shave whiskers, let alone sandpaper. So we were all fired when we were laid off. You know. So in between jobs, teaching licenses in those days didn't have a picture on them. And my roommate, before I was married, and he was my roommate at Cornell too, had won the New York State gingerbread contest when he was 13, and he was now a chef. No, excuse me, he was working to be a chef, but meanwhile he was a waiter at the Waldorf Astoria bar called the Bull and Bear that's still open. So he would come home at night with $1,000, 1960, $1,000 in cash and tips in his pocket. He would open a dresser drawer and throw it in. And I guess when all the drawers were jammed with money, he said he was going to go off to the Virgin Islands, to St. Thomas, and open a fancy restaurant called the Club Comanche, which he did do, and the Comanche's still open down there, although Dick's passed on. So he left his teaching license. He taught one day, and he said, you'd have to be out of your mind to do that for a living. There was his teaching license. I was in between jobs. I figured I'll substitute teach in Harlem. Nobody cares except the parents. So I instantly got work because they had a hard time keeping every class full. And I got a Spanish class for my first class. Now I speak 80 words in Spanish, but I can tell time in Spanish. So I asked the kids whether they knew how to tell time. They said no, and I said, well, I only have you for 40 minutes, but it only takes 20 minutes to learn how to tell time. So I taught any of these classes, 5. By the third class, the principal, white of course, because it was Black Harlem, and I wouldn't dream of hiring a black principal. She comes in, her face is beet purple in color, she's so angry. Like the bomb in Times Square, steam is coming out of her ear, takes me out in the hall, tells me I've ruined the curriculum for the month of June. How will she explain it when the regular teacher comes back? I said, there must be some mistake. All I did was teach her how to tell time. It takes 20 minutes. But that was the entire curriculum for the month of June. She informed me I never would be hired at her school again. But that's all right, because the New York City schools were desperate for subs. So the second job I got was in Spanish Harlem. I was given a 3rd grade class in remedial reading. And before the class started, a little girl named Milagros Maldonado, I'll die with her name in my mind, came to the desk and said, I don't belong in this class. You know the way a lot of times little girls, but little people have a strong sense of justice. She said, I can read anything. And I said, no, this is all done scientifically. Little did I know. And she said, pick anything off the teacher's desk here, and I'll be able to read it. So I picked up this big, thick reader, cracked it open. It was for an 8th grade. It was the Devil and Daniel Webster. The sentences are 200 words long. They run backwards in the Latinate style. And the little girl flawlessly reads it. I said, don't worry, Milagros. I'll speak to the principal. Sometimes mistakes are made. Well, spoke to the principal. She turned beat red, came out of her. Said she wasn't in the habit of taking advice from a substitute teacher. She said, Mr. Gatto, you have a lot to learn. These children are cunning. They will memorize the story and pretend. I said, if they go memorize the Devil and Daniel Webster in Hollywood on American Idol or something. So she said, I will come in at 3 o'clock and show you. Well, Milagros could, as she said, she could read anything, just as I could when I was her age, anything. And she said, Milagros, you will be moved on Monday. And then she turned to me and said, Mr. Gatto, you never will be hired in the school again. So I was beginning to get something was up, even though I'm sure these ladies were not part of a conspiracy. They had learned that their good employment depended on not deviating from the template they were handed. How are you going to change that requirement? If you change that, it wouldn't be schooling, would it? In schooling, if one fin moves, all the fins move simultaneously. If one fish does a triple wiggle, they all do a triple wiggle. So these people know that that's what they've been hired to do. All the rest of it, they might chat over a cup of tea or a beer, and they might even, if no one's looking, make an exception for this family or that. Not many exceptions. I learned about the exceptions when every year some wealthy children would vanish from my class. They would reappear in the winter, and reappear 6 weeks later. And they had gone on a cruise in the Mediterranean or in the Caribbean or somewhere. And the school didn't have anything to say about that. But if I asked if one of my kids could go to the Metropolitan Museum because he had a particular interest in armor, to study the armor collection over there, that would have to be approved by the assistant principal, by the superintendent, by the school board. And of course, the kid would have graduated by the time all those things had been signed off on. So I saw there was a double standard at work. And of course, politically, how could there not be? You can't tell an influential parent that her kid can't take an opportunity, because she knows how, or he knows how, to pull the levers of power, and the most highly placed school person is way, way down on the pecking order of power. They're all flunkies. They're all flunkies. The guy they picked to be in Washington as the czar, they're flunkies. They're political appointees. They don't know a thing about teaching anything except by accident. Yeah, now you have my opinion, school administrators. Of course, you're paying their salaries, their early retirement. What was the question? You see why I have to have a script. Yes?
Do you think it's possible to raise a passionate learner and an independent thinker while they go to public school? Or
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes, if you provide the opportunity for enough, now this will sound more grandiose than me, for enough life-changing experiences, if you understand what colonial Americans all understood, that there is no such thing as adolescence. Let's start there. It was an invention of a group of academic lunatics in the early 20th century. It doesn't exist in human history. So that all these strange behaviors you get from so-called adolescents, you're watching somebody who you're deliberately driving insane by artificially extending their childhood. Now let's get back to pre-adolescence. Nowhere in the world at any time in human history was somebody older than the age of 7 considered to be a child. If you treated them as a child, they were, on the face of it, parasite. They had to take a part in adding value to the family, to the community. Let me tell you a magical secret. If you simply do that, your kids will start to educate themselves. And if you protect them from adolescence, which is easy to do the minute you step back far enough and say, how does the world know my kid's an adolescent? Well, he pulls gum out of his mouth like this. He grins all the time. He slouches. He dresses like a bum, you know. But he'd love to have this range of opportunities. He'd love to be an intern in the police department or at City Hall, you know, or to run a business where it's pretty easy as a teenager to make an adult income. You have the energy to accept rebuffs, and the key to getting wealthy in this country is one way. It isn't inventing, you know, a scientific discovery. It's sales. All the CEOs of all the corporations come up through the sales route. Now and then you'll get an oddball who came somewhere else. They're all in the business of sales. Why would they put somebody who's an A student, you know, to determine the disposition of the company's resources? They're all salesmen. Well, Warren Buffett's earning about triple an adult income. He starts out at age 6 selling ice cold Coca-Cola in steaming hot Omaha, Nebraska. During the Depression, nobody has air conditioning, and Buffett has a basket full of ice and Coke. He never comes home with an unsold Coke. He puts the profit away, a penny a bottle or 2 pennies a bottle, and eventually he hires other kids to do this. He's 7 now. He multiplies he supplies the ice, the basket, and he pays, you know, half the earning to the kid. When Buffett is 8, give me a second here. Buffett reads in a newspaper that at the racetrack, a lot of people get impatient, tear their tickets up, and walk out because their horse is not first and the race is halfway over. But now they're winning tickets laying around. He reads that. He takes garbage bags. He fills them with discarded tickets. And sure enough, he finds winning tickets often enough that he says, if I gathered all the discarded tickets, if I paid kids a commission, and I paid them out of the winning tickets they found, and he now has another stream of revenue. He then invents a newspaper. I delivered about 80 papers a day, and it is hard work. Buffett was delivering 1,500 newspapers a day. He was no stronger than I was, but he was a lot smarter. He arranged with the newspaper to deliver the papers, not at the street level, but at the top floor of the roof of big apartment buildings. He'd take the elevator to the top, race down, you know, the door opens, he flings the papers, 1,500 papers a day. He was offered the circulation directorship of the newspaper when he was 13 years old. Then he discovers that a lot of people who have more money or too lazy play golf, and when the golf ball goes into the woods or into a water hazard, they put another golf ball down. So he harvests used golf balls, sells them to the club professional in bulk, and as soon as it works, he hires kids to do it for him. I'm missing one. The last business is probably the wackiest of all. He learns where he can rent pinball machines. And then he makes contacts with barbers who are popular. And the barbershop's full of customers waiting to get their haircut. He says, I'll put the pinball machine in the barbershop, and I'll split 50-50 with you to take. And I'll do all the work. Would you be crazy not to accept a Warren Buffett pinball machine? Now he's got 5 streams of revenue coming in, and by the time, I think it's 1939, he's ready to go to college. Warren Buffett has the equivalent inflation adjusted of $100,000 in the bank. He applies to the Wharton School of Business, and they turn him down. Why would they want somebody? It's a cult. It's a secular religion. It's a jobs project. And you can, in fact, introduce your kids to enough experience. Read what Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Franklin were doing at 11 and find analogs to that in, am I in Salem, Oregon? Yes, find analogs to that. It's not hard. It makes your life very exciting, and your kid only needs to make his first $1,000 in a business or to circumnavigate the city of Salem, map it out and get an article about it in the newspaper, and then you tell him if he can get it published in the newspaper, you're going to let him circumnavigate the state of Oregon. And if he gets that in the newspaper, the United States, and that all by itself will entitle him to a full tuition scholarship at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, or Stanford. How do I know that? Because they had a private audience with the admissions director of Harvard. And I said, what's this I hear about grades and test scores not being the key determinant of getting in? And she said to me, they're not adequate evidence of excellence. We only accept students at Harvard who have a track record of excellence. The guy at Princeton said, I look at hobbies first. I said, I was taught to leave hobbies off because nobody cared. The guy at Princeton said, on the contrary, it's the only reliable information that a young person provides. Everything else that they provide could have been supplied or done in tandem with an add-on. This tells you what's in their mind and their heart when their time's their own to spend. Well, what do you look for? Well, he said, personally, I look for a hobby in which the kid is risking life and limb. Because if he doesn't know what he's doing, he could end up dead. Like what I said, trail riding, where you have to duck under the low branches, otherwise your head goes in one direction and the horse and you go in another. Sailing a one-person boat out of sight of land, because if you don't understand what you're doing and a wind comes up, you can end up in the middle of the Pacific. Or he said, no one on earth could make this up. Seatless unicycle riding over broken terrain. He just accepted it, kid. That was his credential. He got accepted on. Obviously, there are no rules for that sport except what you make up yourself. And you're constantly competing against your historic performance with your seatless unicycle. You couldn't even imagine it. Oh my goodness. Yes. And somebody else.
I think we can do about 5 more minutes.
Okay.
Then we need to do.
Okay. And then now that you've got pitchers of beer to go to and all that. What time are we on tomorrow?
9 o'clock. So tomorrow from 9 to 4, there are workshops at the second floor of Tea Party Bookstore, which is the corner of Trade, and David said he'd do the
9 a.m.
So don't worry. 9 to 4 p.m. That's right. And then tomorrow evening there's at what time, Michelle? There's a banquet dinner at the Marco Polo restaurant at 6:30.
Who's playing the violin at that dinner?
I was asked to do that.
Oh. So you don't have to worry about bringing it.
So please come. Yeah, maybe last Wednesday.
What time am I on tomorrow? I require about 15 hours of sleep.
I volunteered to go first.
So what time would I be on?
Till about 11, I think.
Okay.
10:30.
I'll warm them up for you.
We have 5 more minutes. Killer questions, perhaps?
In all your world travels, have you seen any rays of hope, countries where the kids are not being pulled into the abyss?
Now, if I say everywhere, I don't want to be sappy. Wherever I go, like the grass in spring, you see a green shoot here and a green shoot there. Malaysia is a particular favorite of mine because the only compulsory subject in secondary school is entrepreneurship. Writing your own script to make a living. That was imposed on the country by a fellow who I think has either passed on or he's not the premier anymore. But he said Malaysia will never be able to compete with the great industrial nations of the earth on their own ground. So we're going to have to write a game that we can play better than they do. So thinking about providing your own living, I was a paid employee for most of my life, but I never made as much money as when I decided to show kids what the Premier of Malaysia did. I'd been watching out of the corner of my eye street peddlers in New York for years, and I was pretty certain that they made boxcar amounts of money. So I tried it myself. I have no artistic ability at all, but I bought a bunch of little plastic rings, clear plastic rings, and a bunch of pieces of colored plastic. And I glued the colored plastic to the top of the clear ring in all kinds of weird shapes. And I set up a ring table. I was being paid $25 a day as a school teacher. The first day I was on the street, I made $125, which really impressed me. It was all in cash. And the second day, some wonderfully flamboyant guy with a floppy hat and a cape on came by. He had a retinue. Who knows what he was? A designer off the boat or something. Snapped his fingers, and the slave swept all the rings on my table off into the bag and said, "How much is owed?" And I just paid. I said, "Oh, it's $300. That's a tremendous amount of work. Probably was 2 hours work and about $10 worth of plastic there." So I knew that I'd hit onto something. So forever after, I would send kids out to spy on street peddlers that set up across the street, count the number of transactions. I showed them how, using the yellow pages of a phone book, to find out where the people got their material. And then we figured out from their sales price what they were making per item. You could roughly figure out that somebody who sells umbrellas on the street when it's pouring rain expects to go home with $1,000 profit. This is back in the 60s, mind you. Doctor didn't expect to get home with that amount of money. Of course, it doesn't rain every day, but it is pretty cold every day. And somebody who sells earmuffs, gloves, and scarves on the street expects